The dense Alaskan forest stretched as far as the eye could see, an endless sea of towering evergreens that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Sarah Wilson peered out the window of her small Cessna plane, scanning for any sign of movement below that might indicate the rare birds she had come to find. For over an hour, she had flown a grid pattern over this isolated region of southeast Alaska with no luck. The boreal forest was vast and unforgiving, its secrets jealously guarded. Most biologists would have given up by now, but Sarah was not so easily deterred. Something had drawn these birds to nest here, and she was determined to discover what. As she banked the plane around for another pass, a glint of reflected sunlight caught her eye through the trees. Banking lower, Sarah spotted a small clearing with a structure at its center, an isolated log cabin nestled in a small meadow. It was the only sign of human habitation for miles. Hope surged through her. Perhaps the cabin's owner had seen the bird she sought. She circled once more to get her bearings before touching down in the clearing, the wheels bumping roughly along the uneven ground until the plane rolled to a stop, cutting the engine. Sarah took a deep breath to steady her nerves. The dense forest pressed in all around, its silence unnerving. Shouldering her backpack and camera, Sarah dropped from the wing onto the soft earth. The air was crisp and smelled of pine, but carried an underlying musk she couldn't place. Warily scanning the tree line, she started towards the cabin. It was solidly built from rough-hewn logs, at least a century old, judging by the weathered appearance. A rickety porch wrapped around the front, its boards sagging under her weight as she climbed the steps. Peering through a grimy window, she saw only shadows within. Knocking yielded no response, so she tried the door, surprised to find it unlocked. Creaking open, it revealed a single, sparsely furnished room. Dust coated every surface, yet the place seemed lived in, with supplies and equipment neatly arranged. A fire still smoldered in the stone hearth, emitting the strange, musky odor she had detected outside. Her eyes were drawn to a bulletin board on the far wall, covered in papers. Stepping closer, Sarah gasped. They were photographs of dead animals. They were photographs of dead animals, their glassy eyes staring back at mounted trophies. But it was the precision of the kills that sent a chill through her. Clearly not hunting accidents. Under each was a label with a name and date. The most recent, only a month ago. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Sarah whirled with a scream, coming face to face with a man. He was of average height with a stocky build, weathered face, and cold eyes that assessed her with predatory calm. His thick beard and hair were flecked with gray, but he was still powerfully built, an aura of danger clinging to him like the musk in the air. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Name's Steve Jordan. This is my place." Sarah struggled to find her voice. I'm Sarah Wilson. I was just looking for the owner, hoping you might be able to help me." Jordan's eyes flickered to the bulletin board and back, a small smile playing at his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Find something interesting?" She nodded hesitantly. "I'm a wildlife biologist, studying the local bird populations. Was wondering if you've seen any unusual species around here lately?" He considered this, scratching at his beard. "Can't say I have. This is prime hunting country, though, and things have a way of disappearing out here." His tone sent a chill through her as his meaning became clear. "Well, thank you for your time. I should be going now," Sarah said, backing towards the door. Jordan moved to block her path, his bulk filling the doorway. storms rolling in fast. Won't be safe flying until it passes. You're welcome to wait it out here, if you'd like. Sarah glanced outside at the darkening sky. Distant rumbles of thunder echoed through the trees as the first fat raindrops began to fall. She was trapped with this man, alone in the vast wilderness. A primal sense of danger screamed through her body, but she tried to remain calm. "All right. Thank you for the offer of shelter." Sarah edged around him, every muscle tensed to flee at the first sign of threat. But Jordan merely smiled and gestured for her to sit by the fire, retreating to a corner to sharpen his hunting knife, watching her all the while from the shadows. The hours dragged by as the storm raged outside. Jordan said little, content to let the crackling fire and howling wind fill the silence between them. Sarah feigned studying her notes, but was hyper, aware of his every move, her fear growing with each scrape of the blade against stone. When had the musky odor in the air grown so pungent? As night fell, the cabin was plunged into an inky darkness, only slightly held back by the fire's dim glow. Jordan rose and added more logs, stoking the flames higher, so they danced across his weathered face. "Best get some rest. I've got an extra bedroll you can use." He tossed it to her, and Sarah caught it reflexively, recoiling at the feel of something damp and leathery beneath the canvas. She dared not look, curling into a ball as far from the fire as she could, while still feeling its meager warmth. Jordan's low chuckle followed her into a fitful sleep, haunted by the glassy eyes in his trophies and the musky stench that now seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Sarah awoke with a start, every muscle tensed in fight or flight. Pale gray light filtered through the cabin's grimy windows, the storm still raging outside. She was alone. Jordan had disappeared sometime in the night. Rolling from the lumpy bedroll, Sarah stretched stiff limbs, wincing as old injuries protested. Her mind raced, weighing options. The plane was surely unusable in this weather, but she had to get away from Jordan. Searching the cabin yielded only a rusty hatchet and some jerky, meager provisions, but better than nothing. Shouldering her pack, Sarah crept to the door and peered out. Heavy rain still lashed the clearing, trees groaning as the wind battered their branches. No sign of Jordan yet, but she knew he was out there, watching. A glint caught her eye. Her plane sat untouched, as if beckoning her to flee. But as she started towards it, a low chuckle sounded from the tree line. Leaving so soon. Jordan emerged, leaning casually against a tree. I was hoping we could have some fun first. Sarah backed away slowly. "Let me go, please. I won't tell anyone, I promise." He pushed off the tree, prowling closer with slow, deliberate steps. "Now, where's the fun in that? This is my domain, little bird, and you flew right into my hands." Lightning flashed, illuminating predatory smile. The hunt is on. Jordan lunged and Sarah spun, sprinting for the cover of trees as thunder boomed overhead. Her breath came in ragged gasps, lungs burning from the exertion. Brambles tore at her clothes and skin, but she dared not slow, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer behind her. A massive fallen log barred her path and she scrambled over it, losing precious seconds. Crashing through the undergrowth, she dared a glance back. Jordan vaulted the log with inhuman grace and was closing the distance fast. Sarah pushed on, dodging around trees as the forest blurred into a nightmare. Kaleidoscope. Her foot snagged a root, and she pitched forward with a cry, landing hard in the damp leaves. Rolling onto her back, she fumbled for the hatchet as Jordan emerged from the foliage, stalking towards her with predatory calm. "It's over, little bird. Time to stop struggling." He kicked the hatchet from her grasp with a booted foot. Sarah scrambled backwards on elbows and heels, coming up against a thick trunk. Trapped with no way out, she stared up at Jordan with wide, terrified eyes, panting for breath. He crouched before her, reaching out a calloused hand to gently brush wet hair from her face. Such a pretty thing. Pity to waste it all at once. Jordan's touch sent revulsion coursing through her veins, fueling a primal surge of adrenaline. As he leaned in closer, Sarah lunged, sinking her teeth into his thick wrist with all her strength. He roared, rearing back to clutch the bleeding wound. Sarah was already running, fueled by fear and adrenaline, weaving between the trees with renewed vigor. Her pursuers' shouts of rage echoed behind her, driving her onward through the storm. Forest blurred into a nightmare as Sarah fled blindly, branches whipping her face. She dared not look back, lungs searing with each gasping breath. At last, her foot caught on a root and she tumbled down a steep embankment, landing hard in a shallow creek below. Groaning, Sarah rolled onto her back, rain pounding her prone form. Above, the tree line swayed ominously, backlit by flashes of lightning that silhouetted towering trunks like grasping fingers. Had she lost Jordan? Her heaving breaths steamed in the chill air, mingling with the musky scent that seemed to cling to everything in this cursed forest. A snap of a breaking branch jolted her upright, every muscle tensing to flee once more. But the embankment was too steep. She was trapped in the open creek bed, scanning the shadows. Sarah's eyes fell upon a massive hollow log, half submerged in the rushing water. She scrambled inside just as Jordan's hulking form emerged at the top of the embankment, scanning the forest with a predator's keen senses. His wrist was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, but the wound didn't seem to slow him. Crouching low in the cramped space, Sarah stifled her ragged breathing, praying the rushing water masked any sounds of her retreat. Jordan prowled the creek bed, coming within feet of her hiding place. For an agonizing minute, he stood motionless, as if sensing her presence. At last, he turned and disappeared back into the forest shadows. Sarah let out a shuddering breath of relief, collapsing against the damp wood. She was alive, but still trapped in this nightmare realm with a depraved killer on the hunt. Jordan was toying with her, allowing brief moments of hope before the terror began anew. As the storm began to abate, Sarah knew she couldn't hide forever. She had to turn the tables on her hunter if she wanted to survive. But how could she outwit a man who knew these woods like the back of his hand? Night was falling once more, and with it would come Jordan's return to the hunt. Sarah had to act quickly if she wanted to turn predator into prey. Darkness fell like a shroud over the forest as Sarah huddled in her damp hollow, listening to the gurgle of rushing water and her own ragged breathing. Her body ached, limbs leaden with exhaustion, yet mind still racing with adrenaline. Jordan would be coming soon to continue the hunt. She had to act, but what chance did she have against a man who knew these woods like his own skin? An idea began to form as Sarah recalled the terrain. If she could lure him to a place of her choosing, turn his skills against him. Crawling from her shelter, Sarah scanned the inky tree line, senses straining for any sign of approach. The forest was deathly still, save for the patter of residual rain. She had a small window of opportunity. It was now or never. Steeling her nerves, Sarah splashed into the creek, letting the current carry her downstream as silently as possible. Tree branches whipped her face and snagged her clothes. But she dared not slow, guided only by the rushing water's pull. At last, her foot caught on a submerged log, and she was flung from the creek, tumbling down a muddy embankment into a vast swamp. Black, foul-smelling water lapped at the gnarled roots of ancient cypress trees, rising like sentinels from the mire. Sarah hauled herself onto a twisted root, shivering in the chill. According to her mental map, this swamp marked the boundary of Jordan's territory. If she could lure him in far enough, its treacherous terrain might level the playing field. Taking a deep breath to steady frayed nerves, Sarah let loose an ear. Piercing scream that echoed unnaturally through the still swamp. She fell silent, listening with bated breath. At first, only the gurgle of swamp waters and her own pounding heart responded. Then, faintly, a distant howl rose in answer. Jordan had heard and was coming. Sarah splashed deeper into the swamp, kicking up mud to obscure her tracks. Cypress knees jutted from the black water like grasping fingers, gnarled roots twisting beneath the surface in a tangled maze. She picked away carefully, pausing to scream periodically, guiding Jordan ever onward. The hunter crashed through the undergrowth, closing in with predatory focus. His quarry was leading him into unknown terrain, but Jordan was unafraid. He knew nature's power and how to bend it to his will. Sarah's screams were growing more distant, carrying on the still air. Jordan increased his pace, splashing into the swamp's foul waters. His boots sucked deep in the mud with each labored step, the terrain slowing his pursuit. Ahead, Sarah scrambled up a massive cypress, clinging to its rough bark as she scanned the swamp. Her screams had done their job. Through the maze of gnarled trunks and grasping roots, she spotted Jordan's hulking form picking his way deeper in. He was well within her trap now. As Jordan paused, tilting his head to listen for direction, Sarah swung down from the tree and splashed away as quietly as possible. She had to keep him distracted and disoriented among the swamp's traps until her final play was ready. Jordan growled in frustration, smashing his fist against the nearest cypress. The little bird was toying with him now, leading him on a merry chase through this wretched place. But two could play that game. He began circling methodically, eyes and ears straining for any sign of approach. There, a splash in the distance, barely audible over the swamp's gurgles. Jordan changed course, splashing after the sound with renewed vigor. Sarah led him on a winding path, always staying just out of sight among the cypress shadows. Her body was at its limit, but she had to hold on a while longer. At last, the terrain began to slope upwards. She was nearing the ridge that formed the swamp's heart. Clambering up the muddy incline, Sarah hauled herself onto a massive fallen trunk that spanned the gap, its roots still clutching the opposite ridge like gnarled claws. She was high above the swamp now, the perfect vantage. Below, Jordan prowled the treacherous terrain, growing more frustrated by the minute. This wretched place was fighting him at every turn, slowing his pursuit. An unnatural splash drew his attention. There, across the gap, a fleeting shadow disappeared into the trees. With a roar of rage, Jordan charged at the fallen trunk, scrambling up its slippery bark with inhuman agility. Halfway across, he faltered, the trunk shifting precariously under his bulk. Looking down, he saw for the first time the tangle of interwoven roots, and the gaping hole his pursuit had created. The trunk groaned, beginning to roll sideways into the abyss below. Jordan lunged, but it was too late, momentum carrying him over the edge to plummet into the waiting swamp. His enraged howl was cut short by the sucking splash far below. Sarah peered down into the inky waters, barely able to make out the ripples fading into the darkness. Had she done it? Ended this nightmare once and for all? She didn't dare linger to find out, scrambling down the far side of the ridge and plunging back into the swamp's protective shadows. Exhaustion pulled at her like weights, but she had to keep moving. The hunter had become the hunted, and she held all the cards now. All that remained was to finish this on her terms, with the swamp as her ally. Sarah began circling back the way she came, following a plan to end Jordan's depravity for good. The swamp fell deathly still as night descended, its inky waters reflecting the pale moon filtering through gnarled branches. Sarah clung to the bole of an ancient cypress, shivering in the chill as exhaustion pulled at her like weights. She had survived another day, but the hunter was still out there somewhere in the darkness. Jordan knew these woods and would not be so easily defeated. Sarah had to end this once and for all before her strength gave out. Peering through the shadows, she began picking her way back the way she came, following the mental map of the swamp's layout. Her plan hinged on luring Jordan to a place of her choosing for the final confrontation. But first, she had to find him. A splash in the distance made her freeze, every muscle tensing. Had he found her already? Sarah listened with bated breath, straining eyes piercing the inky swamp. Nothing but the gurgle of waters responded. She was too exhausted to run any longer if discovered. Pushing onward, Sarah splashed as quietly as possible through the treacherous terrain. The swamp seemed to come alive in the darkness, gnarled roots twisting like grasping fingers from the depths. Was that a shadow moving among the trees? A snap of breaking branches jolted her around, heart leaping into her throat. But the swamp remained deathly still. Sarah was jumping at shadows now, fraying nerves stretched to their limit. She had to end this and get out of these cursed woods. Deeper into the swamp, she picked her way, following the mental map. At last, a massive fallen trunk emerged from the gloom ahead, its roots still clutching the opposite ridge, the place where she had sent Jordan plummeting. Clambering shakily up the slippery bark, Sarah peered down into the inky waters. Nothing but ripples disturbed the surface, fading into the darkness. Had the fall killed him after all? A sense of dread crept up her spine, instinct screaming of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows. She was not alone. Splashing sounded from the far side of the ridge, and Sarah spun with a gasp, emerging from the gloom like a nightmare given form. Was Jordan, hulking shoulders, heaving as he dragged himself from the swamp. His clothes were in tatters, skin scraped and bleeding from countless cuts. But it was his eyes that sent a chill through her, burning with primal rage. "So, we meet again, little bird." His voice was a guttural rasp. "Thought you'd be rid of me so easily?" Sarah backed away, slowly along the fallen trunk. "It's over, Jordan. You're hurt and exhausted, and I know this place." He laughed, the sound like bones grinding. "It'll end when I say, and I'm not finished with you yet." With a roar, Jordan charged, scrambling up the trunk with inhuman speed. Sarah spun and ran, feet slipping on the rein. Slick bark as he closed the distance in great bounds. A massive root jutted from the trunk ahead, and she leapt, grasping it to swing down onto a lower bough just as Jordan's bulk crashed through where she had been. He snarled, lunging after her once more. Sarah swung to the next branch, feeling it groan under their combined weight. Looking down, she saw the swamp far below, gnarled roots and grasping cypress knees, waiting to claim any who fell. An idea formed, a desperate gambit to end this, once and for all. As Jordan lunged again, she dropped, grasping the branch with both hands and swinging her legs up to lock around his thick neck. His momentum carried them both out, dangling precariously over the abyss. He clawed at her vice-like grip, eyes bulging as air was cut off. But Sarah held fast, glaring into his face with feral determination. "Let go," he rasped. "Never," she growled through clenched teeth. "We end this together, or not at all." Jordan's massive hands wrapped around her slender neck, beginning to squeeze with inhuman strength. Black spots danced in Sarah's vision, but she refused to relinquish her hold, even as her grip began to slip on the rein, slick branch. With a final surge of adrenaline born of desperation, Sarah wrenched them sideways, feeling the branch begin to give way under their combined weight. Jordan's eyes went wide with primal fear, realizing too late her intent. They fell into darkness, locked in a death grip, branches whipping around them. The swamp rushed up to claim its prizes with a massive splash that sent ripples fading into the night. For a long moment, nothing stirred on the surface, the swamp once more falling deathly still. Deep below, two silhouettes wrestled and clawed in the inky waters, primal instincts of survival overriding all else. At last, one figure was flung violently upwards, breaking the surface with a gasp to cling to a gnarled root, heaving for breath. Sarah hauled herself from the swamp, collapsing on the muddy shore. Behind her, the waters once more grew still, as if nothing had disturbed their depths. She had survived, emerging victorious from the hunter's domain against all odds. But the trauma of her ordeal was far from over. With the last of her strength, Sarah began the long trek to freedom, putting this nightmare behind her at last. The forest pressed in all around as Sarah stumbled through the trees, clinging to consciousness through sheer force of will. How long had she been wandering? Hours? Days? Time had no meaning in this endless nightmare realm. Her body was at its breaking point, limbs leaden and vision blurring at the edges. But she dared not stop, could not rest until well away from this cursed place. Somewhere out there lay her plane, and with it the means to escape these woods forever. Staggering over fallen logs and pushing through grasping brambles, Sarah began to recognize the terrain. The swamp was far behind now, its gnarled sentinels mere shadows in her fading mind. Ahead, a small clearing emerged through the trees like a mirage, and within, her plane sat untouched. A sob of relief escaped chapped lips as Sarah lurched into the open, collapsing at the tiny aircraft's wheels. With shaking hands, she hauled herself into the cockpit, fumbling numbly with switches and dials through a haze of exhaustion. The engine sputtered to life with a roar that echoed through the still forest. Gripping the yoke with white knuckles, Sarah guided the plane into a bumpy takeoff, wheels skidding along the uneven ground until lifting into the air. Below, the endless sea of trees fell away. Dark canopy, parting to reveal mountains in the distance beneath a pale dawn sky. Sarah allowed herself a shuddering sigh, slumping back in her seat as adrenaline began to fade. She was free at last, escaping the hunter's domain to rejoin the world of man. But her ordeal was far from over. As the plane droned on autopilot towards civilization, Sarah's mind began to process all that had transpired in those cursed woods. Flashes of the past few days assaulted her. Jordan's cold eyes, the musky stench that seemed to cling to everything, her desperate flight and battles for survival. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the cockpit windows. Sarah clutched her head, trying to block out the memories, but they came in a torrent, drowning her senses. With a strangled sob, she lunged for the door, wrenching it open to gulp fresh mountain air. Wind whipped through the tiny space, buffeting her prone form. But the icy blast grounded Sarah in reality, anchoring her to the present once more. She was free. Jordan and that wretched place were behind her now. Gripping the doorframe until knuckles turned white, Sarah hauled herself back inside on shaking limbs. The plane banked towards a valley below, revealing a small town nestled among the trees. Civilization at last, where she could get help and put this nightmare fully behind her. Touching down on a dirt airstrip, Sarah cut the engine with hands that still trembled uncontrollably. Pushing open the door, she half fell to the ground, collapsing to hands and knees amidst curious onlookers. Strong arms helped her upright as a blur of concerned voices asked questions she couldn't comprehend. Paramedics arrived, bundling Sarah into an ambulance, where an IV was started to combat dehydration and exhaustion. Through it all, she remained silent, staring blankly, as the town rushed by outside blurred windows. Flashes of memory still assaulted her, no matter how hard she tried to block them out. At the hospital, Sarah was admitted, doctors and nurses swarming like ants to assess her condition. Physical injuries were minor, all things considered, but her mental state was another matter. She remained unresponsive to all questions, retreating into a catatonic state as a defense against the trauma. In the following days, Sarah slowly began to emerge, recounting her ordeal to police in halting, emotionless tones. Her story was unbelievable, yet corroborated by the evidence. Torn clothes, cuts and bruises in various stages of healing. A search was launched of the area she indicated, but it would be many days before they found what remained. Deep in the swamp, amid gnarled cypress roots and grasping knees, the searchers discovered two skeletons locked in an eternal embrace. Dental records confirmed one as Steve Jordan, the depraved killer who had preyed upon the woods for so long. The other was unidentifiable, save for a tattered jacket with biologist ID. Sarah would bear the scars of her ordeal for the rest of her days, both physical and mental, but she had survived where so many others perished, emerging from the hunter's domain against impossible odds. In time, with support, she would begin to heal, and the trauma would fade to a distant nightmare, no longer able to haunt her waking world. The woods had finally released their grip, allowing one more soul to flee their realm of terror.